Something goes wrong today, small at first. A text left unanswered, a comment that cuts a little too deep, and then it happens again in your mind all day long. You already knew the Buddha solved this 2,500 years ago. You just were never taught how. Right now, somewhere in your life, pain is arriving on schedule, a missed deadline, a harsh word from someone you love, a body that aches in a new place. This is not the part that ruins your day. What ruins your day is what happens next, inside your head, on a loop you didn't choose to start. You replay it. You add commentary. You imagine what you should have said, what they probably meant, what it says about you. By evening, the original event is gone, but the suffering is still running, wide awake, refusing to clock out. Why does one small moment get to occupy your entire nervous system for hours? 25 centuries ago, a man named Siddhartha Gautama sat with this exact question. He had been born into wealth, in a kingdom in what is now southern Nepal, sheltered from sickness, old age, and death, until one day he left the palace walls and saw all three. A sick man, an old man, a corpse being carried to a funeral pyre. That confrontation broke something open in him that comfort had never touched. He left his home, his title, his wife and infant son, and spent years testing every extreme answer available to him. Starvation, isolation, pure ascetic denial, until his ribs showed through his skin and he nearly died from it. None of it worked, so he sat down under a fig tree near the town of Bodh Gaya and refused to move until he understood suffering itself. Weeks later, something in him settled. What he found there became the foundation of Buddhism. And one teaching from it explains almost exactly what happened to you today. It's called the parable of the two arrows. You can find it in the Sallatha Sutta, a short but devastating discourse preserved in the Samyutta Nikaya, part of the earliest layer of Buddhist scripture, recorded from teachings given in the 5th century BCE. In it, the Buddha asks his students a simple question. When an untrained person is struck by an arrow, do they feel pain? Yes, they answer. Of course they do. Then he asks something sharper. What if that same person, still bleeding from the first arrow, is struck by a second one, fired into the exact same wound? The pain, he says, is now far greater, doubled, compounding, not because the injury is worse, but because now there are two of them stacked on top of each other. Here is the part that changes everything. The first arrow is unavoidable. It's the deadline, the diagnosis, the rejection. The ordinary friction of being alive in a body that ages and a world that doesn't cooperate. You do not get a vote on whether the first arrow lands. But the second arrow, the Buddha said, is the one we fire at ourselves. It's the story we tell about the pain, the resentment, the catastrophizing, the 3 hours spent replaying a 5-second interaction, editing it, defending yourself in a conversation nobody else is having. That arrow is optional. And almost nobody realizes they are the one holding the bow. Think about what that means for your evening. The comment that stung you was the first arrow. Necessary, brief, over in a second. But rehearsing it in the shower, drafting the comeback you'll never send, deciding what it proves about how people see you, deciding what it means about your whole week, that's a second arrow, then a third, then a fourth, each one self-inflicted, each one landing exactly where the last one did. The Buddha wasn't telling his students to stop feeling things. He wasn't asking for numbness, and he wasn't asking anyone to pretend a wound doesn't hurt. He was pointing at something far more precise. Pain is a fact. Suffering is a choice made so quickly, so automatically, that it feels like fact too. Is this just ancient poetry, or is there something you can actually use? The Buddha was specific about this, almost clinical, closer to a physician describing a symptom than a mystic offering comfort. In the Sallatha Sutta, he describes the untrained mind as one that reacts to a feeling with a chain of aversion, craving, and confusion, layering distress on top of distress until the original feeling is unrecognizable under everything piled on it. The trained mind, by contrast, feels the same first arrow, the same sting, the same loss. But it stops there. It doesn't reach for the second bow. This distinction between the wound and the wound we add to it isn't a minor footnote in Buddhist philosophy. It sits close to the center of the Four Noble Truths, where dukkha, often translated simply as suffering, is described less as pain itself and more as the friction created when the mind resists what has already happened and cannot be unhappened. You might notice this sounds familiar even outside Buddhism, roughly 500 years after the Buddha. On the other side of the ancient world, a former slave turned philosopher named Epictetus was teaching something strikingly close to it in Rome. Having spent years in bondage before earning his freedom, he had every reason to believe the world simply happened to him. Instead, in the Enchiridion, his short handbook of practical philosophy, He wrote that people are disturbed not by events themselves, but by their opinions about those events. A century later, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius would write something almost identical to himself in his private notebook, the Meditations, reminding himself that if he was distressed by anything external, the pain was not due to the thing itself but his own estimate of it, and that this estimate was in his power to change at any moment. Different traditions, different continents, different centuries. Same discovery arrived at independently. The event lands once. The mind, left untrained, decides to relive it 100 times. Doesn't it make the idea harder to dismiss when three separate men, thousands of miles apart, kept finding their way back to the exact same wound? Here's the counterintuitive twist most people miss. This isn't a call to suppress the first arrow. It isn't spiritual bypassing, and it isn't pretending the sting doesn't exist. The Buddha grieved. He got tired. He faced betrayal from his own cousin, Devadatta, who tried to have him killed more than once by rolling a boulder toward him, and once by releasing an enraged elephant into his path. He wasn't immune to pain. He simply refused to multiply it. That's the twist. The goal was never to feel less. The goal was to stop adding fuel to something that would have burned out on its own in a fraction of the time. Most people think self-control means gritting your teeth through the first arrow, bracing for impact, toughing it out. The older, harder skill is noticing your own hand reaching for the second one, mid-motion, and setting the bow down before it's too late. Modern psychology stumbled onto this same mechanism independently, thousands of years later, without initially realizing it had already been mapped by a man sitting under a tree. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most well-researched treatments for anxiety and depression, is built on a strikingly similar premise. It isn't the event that determines your emotional state, it's the automatic thought that follows it, and that thought can be noticed, questioned, and interrupted before it hardens into belief. Clinicians now spend entire sessions teaching people to catch the second arrow before it's fired, giving it a clinical name instead of a devotional one. Researchers studying rumination have found that the mental replaying of a distressing event, not the event itself, is what predicts prolonged anxiety, disrupted sleep, and low mood weeks later. The Sallatha Sutta described this exact mechanism without a single lab, a single study, a single fMRI scan. It just watched the mind closely enough, for long enough, to see the pattern everyone else was too busy suffering to notice. So what does this actually look like in your life tomorrow? Not meditation retreats, not incense, not a cushion, not a special app. Just a single pause, right at the moment something stings. The email lands wrong. Someone cancels on you at the last minute. A stranger is short with you in a checkout line for no reason you can name. You feel the sting, the tightening in your chest, the flash of heat behind your eyes. That's the first arrow, and it's already over, already in the past, already unchangeable. The question worth asking right there in that exact second is simple. Are you about to fire a second one? Are you about to build a story, a grudge, a spiral, out of something that already happened and cannot be changed no matter how many times you replay it? You don't have to answer that question perfectly. You just have to notice you're being asked it at all. That noticing, the Buddha taught, is most of the work, and it gets easier every time you do it. Try it the next time your day goes sideways. Feel the first arrow fully. Don't flinch from it. Don't perform a calm you don't actually feel. Before your mind reaches for the second one, the commentary, the replay, the imagined argument you'll win in the shower and lose in real life, pause and ask what would happen if you simply let the first arrow be the only one. Some days you'll catch it in time. Some days you won't, and the old loop will run anyway, dragging you through the same 5 seconds for the 100th time. That's fine. That's expected. The Buddha didn't claim enlightenment happened in a single afternoon under one tree. He sat there for weeks, failing and returning, failing and returning. Notice, too, how often the second arrow arrives dressed as something useful. It tells you it's protecting you, preparing you, keeping you sharp for next time. Rehearsing the argument feels like readiness. Replaying the mistake feels like responsibility. But the Buddha's students weren't taught to distrust their feelings. They were taught to distrust that particular disguise, the one where more suffering pretends to be more wisdom. A wound examined once, honestly, teaches you what it needs to teach you. A wound reopened 40 times by the same mind doesn't teach you anything new. It just keeps bleeding. That's the quiet trap in the second arrow. It feels productive precisely because it's familiar, and familiarity is so often mistaken for usefulness. What he offered wasn't a promise of painlessness. It was a map of exactly where your suffering comes from. So you could finally stop mistaking it for something that was ever inevitable in the first place. Something will go wrong again today. Small at first, maybe. a text left unanswered, a comment that cuts a little too deep. And this time, before the second arrow even leaves the string, you already know whose hand is on the bow.